Hello, everybody. It's great to see some new faces as well as some old faces here. I think I do recognize a few people who have been here since 9 a.m. this morning. Now, up here you can see that this is the third panel we have for today, addressing environmental drivers of pandemics. Of course, there's a lot to unpack, but I would like to welcome our expert lineup of guests today. Some of them haven't seen each other for a while and are old contacts, old friends, so it's also a nice time for everyone to interact once more in person. And with that, I'm going to welcome, first of all, Katherine Mchaloba from Eco Health Alliance. She's going to take the podium over here. Following her, we have Serge Morin from CIRAD, Haute Panel, OneHealth. After that, we have Hernan Cáceres Escobar from IUCN. Welcome to the stage. And last but not least, we have Isabella Eckerli from Geneva Center for Emerging Viral Diseases. And to moderate this discussion, I'd like to welcome Keith Martin, who's from the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. Thank you very much to everyone for being here. A bit of housekeeping, you all know the rules already. We have less than 60 minutes for the discussion. Keith, you have the tough task of keeping everyone in line, keeping their responses pretty short so that everyone has a go. We're going to try and have an open conversation and dialogue today. And after that, we have time, as you've mentioned, for a little bit of a Q&A at the end, let's say 10 minutes. And even then, I have to say to the audience, keep your questions short. Just ask a question straight away to make it easier for all of us. With 5 minutes left, I'll come up, give you a little bit of a reminder about what's left, and then we can wrap it up from there. And Keith, I'll let you take it from here then.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia, and welcome everybody to this panel that we have today on addressing the environmental drivers of pandemics. And as you see, we have an all-star cast here, and we're going to make it really interactive. And as Olivia mentioned, the run of show is as follows. Everybody's going to make an opening 1 or 2 minute comments to set the stage. Then we're going to have a discussion for 20 minutes, and anybody can jump in and provide additional comments to anybody's statement. Then we're going to turn it over to you for about 10 minutes, so for some questions and answers. So please raise your hand and I'll get you, but please make sure that you use just 20 seconds for your questions and no more. And then finally, everybody will have an opportunity to make some final comments from the panel. Before I started, just to make a few opening comments, I think we've heard really clearly from the previous commentators this morning in sessions that we know the solutions to deal with these drivers of pandemics, and the time for action is now. The interesting thing is that in the intersection and the drivers of those pandemics, we not only have an opportunity to prevent, detect, and respond to deadly infectious diseases, but we also have behind this the dual crises of climate change and the biodiversity crisis, and the poverty that's deepening not only as a consequence of the current pandemic, but embedded in those challenges, of course, are opportunities. And we know we can actually drive a quadruple benefit in addressing all 4 of those challenges by what we're going to talk about today. So with that, it's a real pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Mchaloba. She'll start first. Hernan will come in second, Serge will come in third, Isabella fourth, and then we're going to start the discussion. Katherine, it's good to see you. Please start. Go ahead and set the stage.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. This topic, I think, is really appropriate for the Health Forum because we're talking, of course, about human health, but also animal health and ecosystem health. And when we really think about environmental determinants, we may be very familiar with things like pollution, but when we look at pandemic risk, we also have to be thinking of things like land use change, changing food systems, wildlife trade, and really how these shape our interactions with other species and the environment and allow for spillover to occur. I think this is actually very logical when we think about these processes. What's really concerning, of course, is that these changes to our ecosystems are happening on a mass scale. So really, we're fundamentally changing our landscapes and putting humans into risk at a profound scale. I think as Dr. Martin mentioned about the opportunities, we see that this is not operating in isolation, so we have the benefit of also bringing together social sciences, looking at the social determinants of health too, and we can't fix these challenges, these mass changes to our ecosystems without also addressing the social determinants. So this is not just a one-dimensional issue. I think this is a major challenge and complexity, but it also opens the door for new collaborations and real solutions that will work. I just want to highlight in terms of the rationale for a OneHealth approach. We've heard about this, I think, throughout the first day of the forum, and that's really encouraging. But when we think about these issues, we need multiple sectors coming together and not just thinking about human health, but also the health of ecosystems and the health of animals, of other species. And it's really important both directly for reducing pandemic risk, reducing epidemic risk, reducing even endemic risk if we look more broadly, but also our well-being overall. So just to thank you so much for bringing this topic here and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much,
Katherine. Wonderful. Elnan, please.
Thank you. Well, it's great to see you all, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Obviously, as Katherine mentioned, we're going through a process where most of these drivers are actually listed and rooted in our own behavior and our own consumption patterns, for example, and that's why we're going through this epoch of the Anthropocene, and we're hearing a lot of that, and basically this means that along with economic growth and human well-being, the interconnectedness of the world, we're having all of these side effects and trade-offs that come with those improvements in life, basically. We see the improvement and the increase for demand, for example, for resources, the population growth, and these are producing this trade-off that we need to look deeply into how our own behavior is actually impacting the surroundings of where we live. There are ongoing crises. We know that biodiversity loss is one of them, climate change, ecosystem degradation and loss, and this seems to be deeply rooted in our own behavior, as I mentioned. So when we look at the Anthropocene, we can see it as this two-side same effect, basically, where we have positive and negative coming into play. As part of it, we know that there's an accelerated number of outbreaks. We're seeing more diverse diseases involving these outbreaks, and different, basically, and more countries as well. So we're seeing that all of these processes are interlinked and basically just increasing the interconnection between the drivers of disease risk. We know that the drivers, for example, we tend to focus on the proxy. We tend to focus on what we can actually see, which is land use change, for example, driving around 30% of the estimated marine infectious diseases. Biodiversity loss, it can amplify or actually degrade how this risk it's created. Then we say same thing with climate change. Climate change, there's a recent paper that came out that basically says that it's likely to become the most important driver in the next few decades. So these are all interconnected, and same thing happens with other issues, right? When we discuss, for example, trade and demand for resources, we cannot let go of wildlife trade and overconsumption. So we see that basically the connecting link among these topics is the facilitation of the infection, shedding, spillover, and spread process. That it's connecting the environmental health, the human health, and animal health. So with that, thank you very much.
Gracias, gracias, Hernan. Serge, appelez-vous, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, and thank you for this invitation. And it's a great pleasure to speak about Katherine and Hernan, because as you heard, they really show that in terms of the science, it's really going quite well. We are working more and more in interdisciplinary. We are providing more and more science-based evidence to the science and to the policy makers. But the other side, I think for the moment, the policy makers are really still working in silos. They are really the public health sector, the veterinary health sector, the environmental sector, several other sectors that are really important, like our trade, are really not really concerned for each other. Sometimes they can work together, the public health and the veterinary health, but for specific problems, for example, rabies or antimicrobial resistance. Why? Why? Because what we are discussing today are what we name weak problems. complicated problems that cannot be answered by simple responses. There is still not so complete agreement between scientists on how to resolve the problem, but for sure there are no agreement between the values of the policymakers and the stakeholders. And this is really how to work with the science, how to provide science-based evidence, if at the same time the sectors are not working all together in facing several problems, including the drivers of new emerging disease.
Parfait. Merci beaucoup, Serge. Isabella, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here today at this really nice forum. So I am the representative of human medicine here, and coming from the human medicine, I think it's interesting that sometimes, or many times, we have this perspective and we are raised in this perspective that there are human diseases, and then there's all the rest. But if we look at like a phylogenetic tree of species, we see that humans are one mammalian species among many thousands of others. And from the point of view of a virus, we are not special. And I think this is something that sometimes we do not really perceive. So now this pandemic has really shown us that a virus will take a host population if it's suitable. So that's what SARS Cov-2 just did with us. And at the same time, we know there are many, many other viruses out there, which are animal viruses, but they have the capacity also to infect one certain type of mammal, which is us. So I think this division that we sometimes have from the human medicine field, that there is a dividing line between humans and animals, it's very difficult when you look at pandemic drivers. And I think as it was already said, so we have a lot of understanding already where spillover happens, what is driving pandemics. So I think it's very important to recognize that a lot of research has been done before this pandemic and that we have a lot of knowledge. So we do not have to start to invent the wheel again because now we had this pandemic. We had many, many near misses, so viruses who almost made it to a pandemic and for some reason they didn't do it. And I think we haven't learned enough from that. And I think this is something for the future that we really have to look at. And on the other hand, I think the pandemic has shown us that science has delivered a lot. It has delivered a lot of data. We have a vaccine. And I think it's amazing what we can do. And on the other hand, it has shown us how difficult it can be to implement these measures. So how hard was it to convince people or still convince people that the vaccine is a good solution, that masks are effective? So I think it's also something that we as scientists have to recognize, that we also have to get our message out there, and that we cannot think in silos. So we need a lot of other disciplines to help us bring this message out, but also we need policy makers and decision makers to listen to us and to make the right decisions, because we know already a lot how we can prevent pandemics, but it will take the necessary steps. And this is not a medical or not a scientific question, but it's a question of society and of political decisions.
Thank you. Merci, Isabella. Now, we've heard some of the drivers outlined perfectly by our panel today. So I'm going to ask Katherine and Irnan the issue of protecting ecosystems, because Katherine, as you mentioned perfectly, that the benefit of the social determinants of health, not the big H medical opportunities. Can you share with the audience what's some of the solutions and how we can protect those ecosystems and communicate those to the policymakers that have to make those decisions?
Thank you. It's a really important entry point that to date hasn't gotten as much attention as it should, because it's a key solution area. I just want to start by saying the quadripartite, the FAO, OIE, UNEP, and WHO, they formed their joint action plan for OneHealth, and there's a really strong environmental focus there. I really want to celebrate that, because that's something very new that we've never had at the global scale. And right now we're also seeing sort of in parallel this focus on climate finance and protecting forests for their carbon sequestration benefits. I think if we sort of join these up and really add in the pandemic prevention dimension, it gives us a lot of new opportunities with existing resources, really, and I think that's really exciting. But I think there are many different ways to bring in the ecosystem dimension. I'll just give an example from Malaysia. Actually, after the first detection of Nipah virus in 1999, there was this decision to change how the country did their pig farming and designate safe areas for pig farming, and then areas where it was not really an accepted livelihood strategy, and also distancing orchard trees from pigsties. I mean, these are very practical changes that can be made, and I think it's very context specific what will work in one ecosystem and one sector, but we need that collaboration to identify those solutions. And I think it's very exciting when we talk about things like ecological buffers around protected areas, where it's really high priority to protect land, and if you can do it in a way where you have those multiple benefits, those co-benefits, so risk reduction for diseases, also climate change mitigation, and many other benefits. I think this is a new frontier for us and really crucial for sustainable development.
No, absolutely. And then the IUCN has created the critical ecosystems, right? So we have a target of what to protect. Ernan, along with Katherine said, how can we communicate to policymakers the importance and need to be able to protect these ecosystems, and then the value proposition to them?
Well, I think a key aspect of this issue is that we're missing the point in terms of collaboration, and also looking at the synergies that are embedded into these systems. When we take a look at the preparedness, we tend to look at solutions that are in line with surveillance and monitoring. But this is something that has been also applied for biodiversity loss, for example, for habitat protection, fragmentation, degradation. There are many tools that are already being used that could be transferred and transformed into useful approaches for the health purposes, basically. So, for example, just to give you something that Katherine said, obviously when we look at these issues, we need this approach of having a real collaboration with people on the ground. We need to step aside from these top-down or bottom-up approaches. We need to embrace the complexity that Serge actually mentioned and transform that into action. I think we can all agree that despite the fact that all these issues are very complex and they're interconnected, but at the same time, there's this urgency for action. And there's a lot that we already know that we can use to improve the system. So when we look at preparedness, the environmental aspects of it will play a key role for sure. And there are a lot of things that are already happening. The Sustainable Development Goals, for example, the HE targets in terms of biodiversity loss, etc. So there are things already in line, but they may be, obviously there is a space for that to actually become operational for health purposes.
Yeah, and these are voluntary targets, which is no obligation to act and no enforcement mechanism. So as you made very powerful comments when we were all discussing this beforehand on the siloing, and you referred to it in your opening comments. Can you share with the audience what we need to do to break down those silos that would enable us to bridge that gap between knowledge and policy implementation?
So maybe first I will tell you a little story ongoing with the European Commission. We were asked by the funding project Eclipse to do a request for biodiversity on pandemics. So we launched a workshop with the different DGs, and actually the DG Santé did not come, but we have the DG Agri, we have several things. But after we realized it was very tough to put them together, so we have to create a focus group to work together and to realize that most of these problems should be done at the level of their each policy, and not only research, but really on the policy, and especially the DG Trade. But after that, I will have to say that another way to break down the silos is to work locally. And there are something, and maybe to switch a little bit our angle or view. I put myself inside. I used to work too much on the bad things, too much on the degradation, deforestation, all of this stuff. Now we should switch on the good things. So, and where to work on the good things? And I would say, one, especially we are working with the UNESCO and the biosphere reserves, which are the places that are really like this. UNESCO is education, science, and conservation. Perfect. And Julian Huxley was one of the founders of the UNESCO and the IUCN. And this, with the biosphere reserve, what we can work? We can work on this problem of ecological restoration, community reforestation, also urban forests, because there is also cities in the reserve of biosphere reserve. And this we can work on, we're starting to work on this. And this we can implement, this kind of solution, nature-based solution that can win-win with the problem of climate change, but also the problem of resilient territories in terms of sanitary or in terms of economy and in terms of well-being, land-based solution, we can really work a little bit. And the last thing that I can say that is I was also quite amazed several places, not only in Thailand when I used to work in Southeast Asia, but in some cities not very far from here. The city of Lyon joined on starting to work on the OneHealth urban cities and to implement the OneHealth, and especially now to implement to how to better manage the animals that can provide problems. And to look at this, why they are doing more nature in the cities. And I think this is the good thing, and there are volunteers, we have local people, local administration that are ready to work. So go on.
Healthy cities is huge benefits, isn't it? Isabella, you're a world-class virologist. You've worked on MERS and SARS and many other things. What guidance can you give the audience in terms of, again, those ecosystem drivers? What are some of the solutions and ways that you've been able to overcome the science policy gap?
I think one of the key aspects is that we have to understand that this really affects our own health. So when I started working on that, being a medical doctor, I once had a conversation with someone who said, yeah, but why are you working on these bad viruses and these exotic viruses? I mean, they're really not relevant for human health, and I would like to have the same conversation today again. So I think it really is something that we sometimes do not recognize how much our own health is linked to all of that, and that it's not just maybe a bit sad because we will lose a few butterflies, a few birds, but in the end, we don't really care because it doesn't have an effect on us. And I think this perception that protecting ecosystems, of course tackling climate change, but also having this healthy environment, I mean, that's really the concept of One Health, having healthy animals, a healthy environment, and then having healthy people. I think this is something that really needs to arrive in our heads, that our own health, our own well-being, is really linked to that, and it's not only something that happens in low-income countries or under certain conditions, but it happens everywhere. It happens also in our highly industrialized places, and I think that's something that we really have to tackle. And also, I think sometimes we forget how powerful we are, how much our decisions, what we buy, what we eat, what we do in our daily life really affects all of this. And I think there is a lot that we as scientists can also do to go out, to deliver our message also to the public. I mean, we have seen this in the pandemic, how important it is also to communicate to the public, to clarify misconceptions, to also fight against fake news. So I think there's a lot that we have to do, or that we have to do together with people who are really experts in communication, to really make people understand that our own living and our own health and maybe even our own survival is really depending on all of this, and that is not just something for national parks or for some very small things that not really touch our daily lives.
Thank you, Isabella. And along those lines, Hernan, it's actually communicating to policymakers who need to make these decisions, right? They've got a lot of things on their plate. In your experience, what is some of the most powerful the value proposition that we can give to policymakers to address the drivers of pandemics that you all shared with us in the beginning?
Well, in terms of, I would say urgency. Something that we've all been discussing is the urgency of the pandemic. In general, like we tend to have this sense of this needs to finish now. But what we may be missing is that if we don't change the way that we're approaching these issues, it will be one faster than we would like to have another one. So I would say, obviously, in terms of the actions, as Isabella said, it's very on search as well. It's very important to collaborate with the community, to have these participatory approaches, to have these learning and education approaches. Something that, for example, comes to mind from the environmental perspective, obviously we have this avoid, minimize, rectify, reduce, and offset approach. We may as well try to do something like that for health purposes. There are areas that are already identified as hotspots, for example. So why are we not having these conversations on how we should approach this issue in a more general manner and actually approach it from a multi-sectoral perspective?
Yeah, and along those lines, Serge, you brought up a bit of a neglected area. It's not a little bit of one, it's a big one, is that the issue of healthy cities as a chance to be able to prevent the drivers of pandemics. And as we urbanize more than 90% of the population growth will go to cities. Can you share with us what we should be thinking about, what policymakers need to be thinking about to build healthy cities that not only address the non-communicable diseases, but also can act as prevention drivers of the causes of pandemics?
Now we have several cities around, big cities actually around the world, but it could be also reach some small, I would say small-scale cities. But yes, first we have to imagine now, as you mentioned, Kees, and more than half of the people are living in the urban area, but it will increase. And now the rural population, especially in the northern hemisphere, will start to decrease for now. And the real big increase will be due in the intertropical region, where there is a huge biodiversity on that rate, where the population in urban will continue to grow with a change, especially in the meat consumption, in the livelihood, and with big impact on the surrounding agriculture area, and also in the place that there also very big increase of the livestock and the poultry, which also a big. And just to remember, the biomass of the cattle on Earth is heavier, more important than the biomass of total humans population. And the number of poultry is close to the total number of the wild birds now. So we have to imagine the world we are living and the world where it's going. And yes, it's starting because it's starting why? Because first, some of the big cities everywhere in the world starting to think about the problem of the climate change and how to mitigate the impact of the climate change using rewilding, using urban forest. And they realize at the same time that doing this, you also provide some very important well-being services for the population. And now they're switching, because of the COVID-19, to the thing that, wow, is it good, is it bad? And maybe is it good, so we continue. So there are several projects ongoing, for example, in Singapore, with all of these urban cities and forest cities, forested garden city, as I mentioned, with notably the better control of some arboviruses like the dengue. We have the case of Barcelona, I told you the case of Lyon, or the case of Mexico with this very huge, actually, is one of the biggest urban forests in the world. And this is quite interesting because they are starting, really, the mayor are really thinking about this, how, on special of the services, how to work together in terms of better provided health and well-being to their populations.
And Katherine, you've been doing really, at EcoHealth Alliance, but also at the World Bank and the WHO, you've been doing really consequential work on the biodiversity, climate, human-animal health interface. So what are some of the things that you've learned in that experience and what we can do, some of the successes that we can look towards that would address those challenges, but also the pandemic prevention side of the equation?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really key partner, development banks and maybe the private sector too in many contexts, and, the finance piece. So I think now it's well appreciated that the cost of inaction is so high that investing in prevention makes sense. I still think, there's this invisible value of prevention, and when people forget about the pandemic, once, hopefully we're out of it soon. I know we're not, there yet, but there's always that risk. We see these cycles of funding, and I think we need this sustained progress by building in risk reduction measures. So the World Bank, for example, has safeguard processes. That's somewhere that risk reduction for disease can be built in. It takes that awareness piece, it takes the logistical aspect of building it in a systematic way. I think also from working with the World Bank, that has so many different sectors under one roof, and that's really phenomenal. We don't have something like that, I think, in any other, organization of that scale. And so bringing that expertise together, working together to see, again, where those trade-offs are potentially in investments, where the co-benefits are, but also saying, okay, what can each sector do on its own to mitigate risk? You know, so if you have a livestock sector investment, make sure that it's done in a way that's not going to increase risk. And same for if you're investing in protecting forests, make sure that you generate those benefits for disease risk reduction too. So I think it's not necessarily an issue of not having enough resources, but making sure that those synergies are made, the trade-offs are recognized in advance as much as possible, or mitigated, you know, to reduce the negative impacts. And from a sustainable development lens, you know, we know there are the 17 SDGs, but we don't do a good job of connecting them in practice. So I think there are real opportunities for organizations to work together under their own roof, but also across too. Thanks. Yeah.
So we're going to go to questions. I'm going to ask the panel one final question here before we go to you. So get your questions sorted out, and please raise your hand when we go to you after this this single question. Capacity building. You've got to be able to have the capacity to implement what we're asking. Serge, please share with us, to what degree is a lack of capacity at a ministerial level, at a government level, across different ministries, not only in health, but in the environment, justice, finance? To what degree is that a challenge that needs to be overcome to be able to implement the solutions we're talking about at this forum?
No, it's a big challenge for them to tackle all of these problems. And I think what Katherine said, that what the World Bank is doing, but some other international organizations are doing. I'm thinking just that United Nations ESCAP for the Asia Pacific region, which are doing the same in terms of how to tackle the problem of environmental health, air pollution, and also all of these biodiversity and health, planetary health, OneHealth. We can reach that by the OneHealth. The OneHealth starting, and especially thanks to the new quadripartite, and starting really to put this together. So trying on, especially now, Katherine will explain a little bit about theory of change, but this starting to be on the ground, starting to that. So we can work now. For me, I work much with the French Ministry of Ecology in France, where they are also implementing a group for the One Health. And we are all the different ministry, but we are also the non-governmental organization. We have the several scientific organization. We are planned, so each of the country have to have a plan of action, some action tracks, where in this case reach not everything, but reach some problems that can be taken by at least two different sectors to force them to work together. And this is what actually the France try to do. So step by step. Of course, there is some kind of urgency at the same time, but.
Katherine, would you want to add anything to what Serge mentioned?
Yeah, I think the capacity building piece, it's crucial from a lot of different aspects. Completely agree within governments. I think just from a workforce aspect, we know in some regions there is extremely low veterinarian capacity. I can think of one country that doesn't have any veterinarians at all. So this is, these are long-term. We need to be investing over decades to make sure there's access to workforce training, investments, so that people have jobs when they come out of those academic training institutes, and then also that they're incentivized to stay and really work in a One Health approach. I think the capacity area is a major opportunity. I think it's a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic example. I mean, just VetAgroSup, one of our partners at the Consortium of Universities for Global Health, they have a partnership with the University of Dakar to train vets in 15 West African countries. But if you look at how many they have, Katherine, as you mentioned, there's almost none. It's just unbelievable. Isabella, please.
Yeah, and I think we now have a very interesting window of opportunity, because now we speak a lot about pandemic preparedness, about surveillance. So I think now is a very interesting time to integrate this, to say we know we need more surveillance for human viruses. Maybe we also need surveillance for the viruses that are already there, but at the same time we can integrate this. So now we will also look at animal viruses, and I think there's a momentum, because people are still a little bit interested in viruses. So maybe that will change at some point. But I think now is a very interesting time, because we also have a lot of advances in technology. So we have all these sequencing developments. Every lab now knows how to do a PCR, and I think it's very crucial that these infrastructures are kept now, so that they are not stopped because we think, well, COVID is not a problem anymore. and then we can go back to normal. And I think it's a very important time now to strengthen this and to keep this capacity at least at a certain level and build on that, add more pathogens, add livestock pathogens, and really connect the different sectors that are working in this surveillance field.
Yeah, Ernan, please.
No, I think just to highlight one of the points that I think we're all trying to make from different perspectives is that we cannot even afford inaction. And I think that's a key area in the sense of we need long-term commitments that are aligned and that we actually, that we align mandates, I would say, across different sectors, across different industries, across different disciplines. But we need that long-term commitment and that long-term process of learning from things that go well and from things that don't go so well. But at the same time, that will advance. And at the same time, this process of learning and this process of transference of knowledge will advance the decision process of politics, will advance the decision process of social education in general. So I think we need that kind of long-term commitment that at the moment we have it, and hopefully we won't miss it and we won't lose it as you said.
Thanks for bringing the point about long-term. And I would encourage folks to look at the IUCN's work. They've got incredible products online. Please take a look at them because they're truly outstanding and usable. Questions, if you can, please raise your hand and keep your question to 20 seconds, please. See anybody? Everybody's answered all the questions? Yes, ma'am, please. Please introduce yourself too.
Thank you. My name is Janice Zanella. I'm from Brazil, and I'm from Brapa in Brazil. I have a question regarding consumption of exotic meat, like game meat, by communities and traditional communities. And my question is, regarding, there's a study in the Amazon region, in Brazilian Amazon, in Colombian Amazon, that people had consumed game meat. 30% of the people that were interviewed consumed meat in the last month. And for them, it's like a cultural and sentimental and type of a festivity. So my question is, how can we prevent this, especially the spillover from game meat to the human population? Thank you.
It's putting the wild meat trade. Who'd like to take that one?
Alan, for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll take it.
As an IUCN question.
So obviously, I think wild meat is one of the key issues that we've been discussing for the last 2 years, right? It's a very complex issue. We can look at it from a sustainability perspective, from a social perspective, from a basically just economics perspective. It's such a complex issue that trying to define it and trying to be very mindful about what we're discussing and what the issue is can lead towards solutions. So for example, you're discussing the consumption of wild meat in these countries. We can make a decision and use, for example, apply tools that have already been developed to ensure the safety and hygiene of meat throughout systems. Also, that will bring us to the question, do the communities want that? Do we need to go through behavioral change? So I think this is a clear OneHealth issue. This is one of those complex problems that we cannot just take from one perspective. We really need to understand it from different dimensions and what are the dimensions and trade-offs that are interacting to develop actions and to develop strategies that will actually solve what you're trying to tackle.
But unregulated wet markets are also a huge problem. Isabella, do you want to talk about that? Because they've been mapped out, and they're a huge spillover risk.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, we still don't know all the viruses that are out there in these animals, but for example, we do have some ideas of certain species that, for example, carry a higher risk. And I think that there can be pragmatic solutions. Of course, it won't be a solution to say you have to stop this. I mean, a lot of this, for example, is already illegal and still it's done. So I think it's not just a question of saying it should not be done, but to find pragmatic solutions. And for example, if you take the case of SARS-1, so there were a lot of species identified that can carry this virus, and then for a certain time they were banned, but then, I mean, this was all a history of the past, and then it came back. So I think there are probably many solutions where you can still keep such cultural practices or such traditions on a scale that is sustainable and still maybe exclude some species where we know they have a higher risk. And I think what should not be forgotten is really the industrial animal farming of livestock animals. So I think there is a strong focus on these wet markets, which for sure play a role. But I think there should be the same focus on farming animals on an industrial scale, also in industrialized countries. So I think sometimes there's a bit of a misconception, I think, because for me this is one of the risks that is equally high as these wild markets. And then another question is how much is really consumed for the community, how much is traded, how much is really exported into other countries, because it's a business model. So I think you also have to somehow make the distinction between what is really part of a cultural, local aspect and what is something that might have changed in the recent decades because there was this opportunity to have different hunting techniques, to sell it to other countries. So I think it's really something that has to be looked at at a scale or at the environment in which you are in. But I think there are many pragmatic solutions that can be found. And we know already a lot about some species where we say maybe these species we should just not touch them. For example, the civet cats, the raccoon dogs, the honey badgers, or all these species where we know they carried SARS-1, they are susceptible to SARS-2. So I think, like I said in the beginning, we know already a lot of stuff and that we could do, but we haven't done it yet. So.
Yeah, no. Serge, please.
Yeah, this is important and complex question because it's a risk problem. So with this, and sometimes we put together several kind of things. The danger, yes, there are dangers, but what is the risk? The risk is really the danger with the susceptibility, so behavior, and also the vulnerability of the system. And the vulnerability of the system, especially for the gaming, is changing a lot in the last decades, from a local one to a more international one, illegally and legally. And with also the farming of the wildlife. And we know that every time we put an animal in the farm system, we got some new disease. We have all these big diseases are coming from our older companion. So we know this. And these are changing very much, the stuff, very fast. And actually, the wild farming is most of the time also a gray area. Because I know that walking on the field, some of these are, for example, one of the things, the rodents. You put the rodents, but not from the rodents from the rice field. You put that into the farm. For the livestock, it's not livestock, it's not poultry, not our concern. For the Department of National Resources, which are looking for the wildlife, they say, no, it's not wildlife, it's pets, it's rodents, it's not from them. So it's completely out of the area. But it's growing, it's big sectors, and it's moving. The rodents are moving there, and they are doing really reproduction, so we can see a stress of domestication. Mm-hmm. And when you see what they are inside this as a danger, wow, we are taking a lot of risk, for sure.
Did you want to add another point? But before, Katherine, did you want to add anything first, or?
I'll just say, the context is so important, and I know we've heard some global calls for bans on wildlife trade, and I think there are so many trade-offs when you talk about that. You could actually increase production in other animals and in livestock, and it could be done in a really unsafe way. So, there's not sort of a one-size-fits-all solution. And I will just highlight our colleague Janice, who asked the question, and Natalia and our other colleagues from the OneHealth high-level expert panel, including Serge. We're looking closely at this. Maybe our colleagues from the panel and the partners can stand up just so people know to reach out to them. But we're really looking at the topic of trade-offs, how to minimize those, really building that into the OneHealth principles, because there is no one-size-fits-all solution. It will depend on the community. It will depend on the local values. I think the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services is really opening the door for that dialogue to be more inclusive, to capture values that really differ across society, and there's no one solution. We need to really be working in the local context. So again, I think that's sort of implementation opportunity, because at a grand scale, it's very challenging to find the right entry points and solutions, but at a national and community level, it becomes very practical, I think, with the local values.
Yeah, no, thanks, Catherine. I think, please go ahead,
Yes.
Anand, and then Isabella.
Great. So yeah, I think basically this comes a lot with the perception values as well. We tend to think that wild meat only happens in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in South America, but when we think about it, in France, deer hunting, wild boar hunting, in Europe, or in the US, it's something common, it's worldwide. We've done studies on how supply chains of accepted commercial systems, for example, for ostrich, for kangaroo meat, for deer, and these are all wild meat that are accepted, and we don't think twice when we see it in the supermarket. It's just this perception dimension as well that changes, and something that Serge said as well is when we also see these systems, we see that they've been changing. They've been changing from these wild-caught systems to a more intensified farming practices, and the mixing of farming plus the naive, basically, populations that we're capturing and we're putting together, that it's a hazard. And we're putting together a lot of hazards, but we go back into these social aspects, demands, and behavioral changes that we need to look into on how we can propose progressive and actually useful practices that could have an impact, because I would say that we can all agree that biodiversity loss, that should be by itself something that should be enough to say, well, this should be managed, basically, or at least looked into in a deeper approach.
No, thanks. Isabella,
I
please.
have to comment. So I think, first of all, also from a surveillance point of view, such communities, if you work with such communities, it can be also a huge benefit, because you have people who have this wildlife interface. So you can implement very smart surveillance projects. You can take blood every 6 months. You can do system serology. So I think there's also opportunities if you work with these communities and not just somehow condemn this, that you can also get a lot of knowledge and learn a lot what can be a safe way of using wildlife and what is a risk that you maybe should not do. And the second part is, I think we should not forget that a lot of the wildlife trade is legal wildlife trade. So we often, when we speak about wildlife trade, it's about illegal, but there is a huge legal trade, and this is basically uncontrolled. So there is no, I mean, there is control for conservational issues, like for endangered species, but there is few control for example, animals that pose a risk of zoonotic diseases. And I think this is something, again, where we are with this silo. So we think about animals that are endangered, but we do not think about animals which are not endangered, but maybe pose a great risk to human health. And there is basically almost no regulation. So a few years ago, for example, there was a new virus discovered in Germany from a type of squirrel that is bred by people who have exotic pets. And it was very difficult to even reconstruct how these animals arrived in Germany, how these breeders were connected. The virus was only found when there were some encephalitis cases. And this highlights very well that this is really like a blind spot, and there is a lot that can be done even in this legal field. So before we even go to communities somewhere and look at this before we go into communities who do this since a very long time, I think there's also a huge range where this is done, where we don't even know what's going on, and we don't have good surveillance system, and we don't have any interaction between human health, between veterinary health. So many times these animals, they do not even fall under any veterinary regulations because they are not seen as livestock. So while it might be very difficult to take a piece of meat with you, it's maybe even easier to take a living animal with you because it doesn't fall under any regulations. And I think there is a lot that can be done in this field that is really, missed by a lot of sectors.
No. And it's a good point that the illegal wildlife trade is actually not only a biodiversity driver, loss of biodiversity and a pandemic driver, but it's also the fourth leading source of revenue for organized crime, and so it's a major criminal issue. And the IUCN and the CBD have done really outstanding work on that. Any other questions for the panel? Please raise your hand. Yes, please. Carlos.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Not yet? Hello? Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Carlos.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
Oh, great. Carlos Byron from the Planetary Health Alliance. I think if we're going to talk about drivers of pandemics, I think we should talk also about global economic systems. And I kind of want to hear from the different panel members. In the institutions that you're representing, how are you bringing this maybe more global macroeconomic perspectives into your work? Are you including economists? Are you calling out pervasive economic systems that are driving the changes that you've all kind of mentioned? So a question for the panelists in general.
On the economic drivers and what are we doing to engage them. And I'd encourage, speak to Carlos, the great work they're doing at the Planetary Health Alliance at Harvard. Carlos, great job. Any response to Carlos? Please, Serge.
Thank you very much for this important question. And actually, it was exactly what some question was raised with the European Commission, and especially the DG Trade, but also the DG Agri. Now, there are something about the reflection on this to implement in the policy on the DG Trade the clause for the imported deforestation, or the problem of pesticide use, especially, for example, some pesticide that could affect a lot biodiversity and insect, and potentially now the DG Agri or some other are really thinking, but they don't know how. But in terms of, it could be also have a huge impact, especially now with the war in Ukraine. So it's not possible really to discuss in a good way, in the rational way, about to implement new policies in terms of the imported sanitary crisis. So and when we discuss with the DG, the different DGs, they said that it's not only the third countries, it's also the European countries that are concerned also by the impact of their policies on their own territories. But how to change the global trade and to take into account this importation of infectious disease, potentially pandemics, but also for the plants or for the animals per se. So complicated, and especially now, we will not discuss about this for some time.
Great, please, Katherine.
Thank you for the important question. I think this is somewhere that academia has such an important role. You know, we at EcoHealth Alliance did some economic models looking at land use change in Southeast Asia. Serge, I know you were part of that, and many of our partners from academic institutions in the region, and looked at the scale of land use change and the impact on malaria incidents. And, you know, it was really striking. You sort of saw where the private benefits were, the private sector benefits, and then when you think about societal benefits and really who pays for the cost of increased malaria, the treatment costs, you know, they were really getting the individual estimates of treatment care for patients, and we don't have a lot of models like that take into account those different outcomes, the ecosystem services that include health. So I think it's a call to action for us to do that research that is more inclusive, and often we see that the environment sector components are not well valued. You know, we don't really usually factor that into the equation and what's lost when you do convert a landscape, you know, from, say, forest to something else, a monoculture. So those trade-offs, I think we have to be very intentional about including, and if we don't have a good estimate of the economic value, I think we can't say, well, we're going to leave it out because we don't have it. We have to, you know, make sure it's in there and just say there's some uncertainty.
Yeah, thanks, Katherine. Please, Isabella.
Yeah, so what I also find interesting, I mean, there are a lot of these modeling or evaluations. Each money that you put into prevention or into preparedness, that comes back manifold. But these were there already before the pandemic. So for after SARS-1, there was a huge number of economic loss because of this outbreak, which looks tiny to what the SARS Cov-2 pandemic has caused. And I think there are many publications on that, and they always say the same. So you have to invest in prevention, you have to invest in preparedness, because there's not only a cost of what you do, but there's also a cost of the things that you don't do. And I think the SARS Cov-2 pandemic has really shown this. I mean, we have lost so much money and so much value and lives. And if you take all of this together, how just a small fraction of that might have, maybe not, prevented this pandemic, but at least it shows that the money is really well invested if you prepare better and it's even better invested if you try to prevent pandemics. But I think this also comes back to what we have discussed before, that you really need this long-term commitment. It's the same in research. So there are always these trends. Now it's SARS Cov-2 in a few years, it will be something else. A few years ago it was Ebola, before that it was Zika. So there's always this short-term focus for a few years on one thing, and then we leave it and we jump off to something else. And I think this is really a problem when we want to investigate the effects of what we are doing, but also to better understand diseases, because the cycle of these pathogens, it's not 1 year, it's not 2 years, it's maybe 10 years, and maybe you are looking for 10 years at a pathogen where everybody thinks it's not interesting. So being a coronavirologist, I know that people who continue to work on SARS Cov-2, they sometimes had to justify why they work on a virus that is eradicated, that is not relevant anymore. But if you think about all the knowledge that could have been gained on this virus in the last, since 2003. So it would have been money very, very well spent, I think. And this is also something that I think we need to communicate.
Yeah, they were great points. Olivia's giving us the 5-minute warning.
I know I'm back here, of course, to wrap things up, but also we have 5 minutes left. I didn't want to interrupt your train of thought. 5 minutes left. And Keith, I'm going to leave it up to you. Do you want to put the panelists once more on the spot and get a Q&A from the audience, or let you take the closing words then?
Yeah, I think I'm going to just ask our panelists, if it's okay with everybody, just you've had such a rich discussion, to please give us, thank you very much, Olivia, to give us your 1 or 2 bullet points in terms of what the audience can actually do to address the drivers of pandemics. And I'm going to start in the reverse order. So Isabella, then Serge, then Hernan, then Katherine. Please tell the audience what are the 1 or 2 top-level things they can take home and do to address the drivers of pandemics.
Well, I think that the main aspect is really that we have to tackle all these problems that we have at the moment. They are complex and they are aggravating each other, but I think the solution to them is a common solution to many of the problems that we have right now. And I think, therefore, we really need to understand that our own health is connected to animal health, to environmental health, to climate change, to biodiversity loss. And this is something that really has to be understood in a common way, and where actors of the different fields have to work together.
Thank you, Isabella. Please, Hernan.
Yeah, so I think obviously one of the key issues that we cannot afford inaction. I would have to remind everyone, we're coming into an era of urgency. We're coming into this restoration decade, but at the same time, even though we're going into this decade, we need to act now. We cannot afford to take 10 years to figure out what we will do in 15 years. Same goes for biodiversity loss, same goes for climate change, and same goes to our health. If we continue to seeing these issues as separated issues, that they all have kind of their own drivers, they may have proxy drivers that are different, but in the end, we really need to look inside our own behavior and how we are basically interacting with the environment as a whole, and change the way towards a common goal. And I think this is one of the key aspects. So far, we want something better, but we're still trying to figure out what better would look like.
Gracias, Hernan. Serge, s'il vous plaît.
Yes, thank you. First, what is good that now there is a very big project and program that are underway. Just to mention Zodiac for the capacity building for the lab, Prisod, among others. But second, and I jump again on the question of Carlos, and we need also to have the economists on board, and especially to think about how to consider that health is not an externality for the economy, but how to re-input the health. So maybe it's not only by the valuation, economic valuation of ecosystem services, but also by the economy of well-being that some economists are working on, and they're interested in this, and maybe we can also have a coalition of scientists with them, and to have really a good change with the economists on board.
Parfait. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Please, Katherine.
Yeah, I think, we have so many experts in the room and working at all different scales, and I think we can really drive action at different levels. So we heard about the global action needed. I think the local action too, whether it's working with communities, whether it's risk communication, thinking about what are the entry points for OneHealth. So some of our teams around the world have been working on biodiversity sensitive risk communication. So if you're going to talk about zoonotic disease risk with communities, really create that trust, make sure you're also talking about protecting ecosystems so that people aren't afraid of the bats in their yard. They'll say, should we cut down the mango tree? And no, try, take safer practices, but also protect the environment. I think those really practical entry points are needed and at all levels. So every day, the work that we're doing, the tools we're creating, guidance, think about how colleagues from other sectors can add value or help to address some of those trade-offs, proactively. I think that's something we can all do and in a really powerful way. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. And on behalf, I think, of all of us, I'd like to really thank the organizers of the forum, Dr. Eric Comte and the teams. You've all done a superb job, and we're exceptionally grateful. And I'd like to thank our fabulous panel, Dr. Isabella Eckerle, Dr. Serge Moran, Dr. Hernan Cáceres Escobar, and Dr. Katherine Mchaloba. Please engage them while they're here. And parting comments from myself, please take a look at our consortium, cugh.org. Please join us in this common effort that we have. We're the world's largest consortium of academic institutions. And I think just from all of us, we have an opportunity, a moment in time when we can address the climate, biodiversity crisis, the social determinants of health, and preventing pandemics all together, because those drivers are interconnected, as we know. Thank you for being here, everybody, today, and thank you for your time and attention. And a big applause for our wonderful panel.